I was standing in my own backyard when I first saw the "for sale" sign, except it wasn't mine. The wooden stake was planted right at the edge of my property line, the bright red letters shouting "sold" across what used to be my vegetable patch. I thought it was some kind of prank until I noticed the smiling HOA president, Greg, chatting with a realtor on the sidewalk like he'd just flipped his own mansion. My stomach dropped as I heard him say, "Yes, the association finalized the sale last week." I had never signed anything. Not a form, not a release, not even an email. Yet, according to them, my land had been sold, without my knowledge, without my consent, and apparently, with my signature. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. I bought this place 3 years ago, a peaceful acre at the edge of a sleepy subdivision that was still half under construction. My house sat just outside the HOA's main cluster, technically adjacent but not under their control. Or so I thought. My corner lot was big, open, and quiet, bordered by a small creek and lined with oak trees. It was perfect. But to Greg and his HOA council, it was underutilized land that spoiled the community's aesthetic balance. They had long wanted to turn it into a community garden, something to add value for all residents. When I politely declined their initial suggestion, they smiled, nodded, and, apparently, went behind my back. I stormed over to the curb, half ready to rip that sign out of the ground, half ready to throttle someone. Greg turned toward me with that smug suburban confidence you only see in people who truly believe clipboards are instruments of divine authority. "Oh, hey, Mark," he said like we were old friends bumping into each other at the grocery store. "Great news, your land's finally going to good use." I didn't even know what to say. "My land?" I asked. "You sold my land?" His grin faltered for a second. "Well, technically, it was part of a community adjustment. The plot was reclassified in last year's boundary survey." My jaw clenched so hard I could hear my molars grind. I pulled out my phone, opened the county parcel map app, and there it was. My property, split neatly in half, with the southern portion now labeled HOA Reserve Parcel. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the conversation again and again, twisting between disbelief and fury. How could anyone just sell someone's property? The next morning, I drove straight to the county clerk's office. The clerk, a tired woman with readers perched on her nose, looked up the file and frowned. That's odd," she said. "Looks like the HOA filed a quitclaim deed, signed by you." I felt my pulse in my neck. "That's not my signature," I said. She turned the screen around, and sure enough, there was my name, well, a version of it. Sloppy cursive, the kind you'd get if a toddler used a crayon. My actual signature was neat, deliberate, always with a sharp M. This one looked like it had been sneezed onto paper. I left the office shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. When I got home, I started pulling out every document I had. My title deed, my purchase contract, my property tax receipt. The HOA had no legal claim. None. I called their management office, which was just Greg's wife's converted laundry room, and demanded an explanation. She put me on hold for 10 minutes, then Greg came on the line, cheerful as ever. "Mark, buddy, let's not make this a big deal. We're working to unify the neighborhood vision. You'll still have access to the new garden. Think of it as a donation." I laughed so hard it scared my dog. "A donation? You forged my signature." Greg sighed theatrically. "You can file whatever complaint you like. The vote already passed." That line hit me like a sledgehammer. The vote already passed. I realized what they'd done. They had held a meeting, probably announced it through those HOA newsletters that everyone ignores, and passed a motion approving the reallocation of my land. I wasn't there. I wasn't even invited. But they didn't need me. The HOA board had somehow convinced enough homeowners that it was for the community good. Maybe they promised a playground. Maybe they threw around the words property value. Whatever the case, my land was gone, at least on paper. But I wasn't about to be another one of their pushover residents who gets bullied into paying for someone else's landscaping. I started digging. Literally and figuratively. I went through the public records, the HOA charter, and every email I'd ever received from them. That's when I noticed something strange. My property wasn't technically under HOA jurisdiction. When the development was built 20 years ago, my parcel had been carved out as part of an older agricultural zone. It had its own zoning code, its own tax ID, even its own utility easement, meaning the HOA had zero authority over it. Their so-called boundary adjustment was built on a foundation of hot air. I called a local attorney, a friend of a friend named Rachel, who specialized in real estate dispute. She met me that evening in her office, a small space with more coffee cups than books. I explained the situation, handed over the forged deed copy, and watched her eyebrows climb halfway up her forehead. "This is laughably illegal," she said. "They'd have to get approval from the county and the owner. You're the owner." They didn't. She looked at me like I was a character in a movie who just stumbled onto the plot twist. "Do you want to go nuclear?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. That night, while the rest of the neighborhood tucked themselves into their HOA-approved beige homes, I sat at my desk crafting the plan. It wouldn't just be about getting my land back. No, they'd crossed a line that went far beyond a fence dispute or parking violation. They'd sold part of my life without asking. So, I'd do something they'd never forget. Over the next few days, I started gathering more documents, and every new page added fuel to the fire. Turns out the HOA had been sloppy. They hadn't paid their annual filing fees for 3 years. Their corporate charter had technically lapsed, meaning they weren't legally recognized as a functioning association anymore. Greg had been running a ghost HOA, collecting dues and issuing fines under a name that no longer existed. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. I decided to bide my time, letting them believe I was just another angry homeowner about to write an angry letter. Greg and his little council strutted around like kings of the cul-de-sac, already marking off my lot with yellow stakes. But I was patient. I wanted to hit them where it hurt, in their power, in their pride, and eventually, in their wallets. The day they started bringing in soil and marking the new community garden boundary, I stood at the window sipping coffee, smiling. They thought they had won. Greg waved at me smugly as if daring me to complain again. I just waved back. Because by that point, Rachel and I had already filed a claim at the county courthouse. Not just for fraud, not just for property theft, but to challenge the very existence of their HOA charter. And here's where fate, or maybe poetic justice, gave me a little gift. In the course of that filing, Rachel discovered something buried in the original subdivision paperwork, something the HOA had either ignored or never realized. The land the entire neighborhood was built on, the one with all their pristine lawns and matching mailboxes, still technically belonged to the original developer. And that developer had gone bankrupt years ago, leaving the ownership rights unclaimed. In other words, I didn't just have leverage over my stolen parcel. I had a key to the whole kingdom. That was the moment I knew how this story would end. They sold my land without permission. Soon, I'd sell their entire neighborhood. I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes right before a storm you already know you'll survive. The HOA still believed I was furious and helpless, pacing my house like a trapped animal. But the truth was, I'd already started moving in silence. Rachel and I spent the entire morning going through the county's land database, sorting through dusty records scanned from the 1980s. Every old plat map, zoning amendment, and deed transfer was a breadcrumb leading to something bigger. She had the patience of a chess player, and I had the motivation of a man who'd just been robbed in broad daylight. Together, we found the missing puzzle piece. A developer's covenant buried deep in the subdivision's foundation documents, stating that ownership of the land parcels, in case of administrative lapse or bankruptcy, would revert to the adjacent landowner. And that adjacent landowner was me. I owned the acre next door. That meant I had a legitimate claim to more than half their lots if their HOA had never properly transferred titles. When I told Rachel that, she looked at me like she was watching a slow-motion car crash. "You realize what this means, right?" she said. "If we file this, you're technically the landlord of the entire subdivision." I leaned back in her office chair, my mind already spinning with possibilities. "Then I guess it's time they start paying rent." We both laughed, half in disbelief and half in the thrill of it. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it felt. They wanted to play with paperwork and signatures. Fine. I'd bury them in it. The first step was confirming the HOA's corporate death. Rachel drafted a request to the state's business registry. Within a week, the response came back. Status inactive. Forfeited due to non-payment of renewal fees. That meant all their legal powers, fining residents, enforcing rules, holding votes, were void. They were, in the eyes of the law, a bunch of neighbors pretending to be an organization. I could practically hear Greg's voice in my head, quoting bylaws that didn't even exist anymore. I drove by the neighborhood office that night, that sad little single-story building with the peeling sign and plastic flowers out front. It looked harmless, but that place had been the source of years of petty tyranny for so many homeowners. Fines for leaving a garbage can visible. Threat letters for slightly mismatched shutters. And now their fortress had no foundation. Rachel wanted to go through official channels, courts, filings, legal notices. I wanted to toy with them first. I called the HOA office from a new number the next morning, pretending to be a potential buyer interested in community development. Greg, ever the salesman, was on the line within seconds. "Absolutely," he said, his voice dripping with self-importance. "We're currently expanding our green space. The association is very proactive." I kept my tone curious, innocent. "And who owns the land around the development? I like to know who I'd be dealing with." He paused, clearly not expecting that question. "Oh, that's all HOA controlled," he said after a moment. "Completely under our management." I smiled to myself. Every lie he told was another nail in his own coffin. That afternoon, I sent Rachel the recording. She grinned. "This man just admitted to controlling land he doesn't legally own. Do you want to go public?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Let's let him hang himself a little higher." We started filing quiet notices, each one strategically timed. A property boundary dispute here. A zoning review there. Every notice triggered a letter from the county, and every letter sent Greg into panic mode. Soon, homeowners started getting copies of these notices in their mailboxes, and confusion spread like wildfire. Rumors started flying at the neighborhood coffee shop. People wanted to know why the HOA was being investigated for fraud. Greg tried to do damage control with his usual smug newsletters, printing lines like, "These allegations are baseless, and our leadership remains committed to transparency." But he didn't realize that Rachel had already contacted the original developer's estate lawyer. The man was ancient, half-retired, and more than happy to share the dusty files still sitting in his basement. Inside those files was a gem, a clause confirming that if the HOA ever failed to maintain its corporate status, the land under its authority would revert to the adjacent property owner holding the oldest registered deed. That was me again. Every road, every cul-de-sac, every manicured strip of grass, they were sitting on my dirt. I decided it was time to rattle Greg's cage. I attended the next HOA meeting, something I hadn't done since they tried to ticket me for improper mailbox height. It was held in the community center, where 20 or so residents sat on folding chairs while Greg stood at the front like a CEO addressing shareholders. He froze when I walked in, holding a thick brown envelope. His voice stuttered slightly as he continued his speech about community harmony. When the floor opened for questions, I raised my hand. "I have one," I said calmly. "Can you explain how my land was sold under a forged deed?" The room fell silent. Greg laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Mark, we've already discussed that privately." I stepped forward, pulling a few papers from the envelope. Not really. And since your HOA charter has been inactive for 3 years, I'm not sure how you discussed anything legally. Murmurs rippled through the room. Greg's face went red, his jaw tightening as if trying to keep his temper from boiling over. Where did you hear that nonsense? He said. I placed a copy of the state's response on the table in front of him. Right here. Directly from the business registry. Your HOA doesn't exist. He snatched the paper, scanning it with shaking hands. The other board members looked at each other, panic spreading like smoke. One resident, a retired teacher named Linda, stood up and asked, Wait, if the HOA doesn't exist, do we still have to pay dues? I could have kissed her for that question. The room erupted into chatter. People pulled out phones, snapping pictures of the document. Greg tried to shout over them, insisting it was a clerical error, but no one was listening. The meeting collapsed into chaos. I just turned and walked out, smiling as the sound of his voice drowned in angry questions. The next day, I got an email from Greg demanding a cease and desist. It was written like a threat but read like a plea. I forwarded it to Rachel, who laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. He's bluffing, she said. He can't even legally send that. Still, we used it. We added it as evidence of attempted intimidation in our case. By then, Rachel had found more ammunition. The HOA had been collecting dues in cash from some residents and depositing them into Greg's personal account. He called it temporary accounting, but the records looked more like embezzlement. We didn't even have to dig hard. Greg's ego did most of the work. He loved putting his name on things. While Rachel built the legal structure of our counterattack, I handled the narrative. I started quietly talking to neighbors, the ones who'd been fined for petty violations or bullied for speaking up. I told them the truth about the HOA's status and showed them proof. The reaction was instant. Some were furious, others relieved, but all of them agreed on one thing: Greg had to go. I didn't even have to lead the charge. The residents called their own meeting, demanded accountability, and by the end of the week, Greg was forced to resign. His smug emails stopped. His updates vanished. The HOA office door was locked with a handwritten, closed for reorganization, sign taped to it. But my work wasn't done. When Rachel filed the final set of ownership claims, the county clerk called us personally to confirm. You're claiming reversionary interest over the subdivision land? She asked, half in disbelief. That's correct, Rachel said confidently. Our client meets the criteria outlined in Section 8 to 17 of the zoning ordinance. There was a long pause on the other end. Well, the clerk said finally, Congratulations, Mr. Davis. On paper, you just became one of the largest private landholders in the county. I sat in stunned silence for a few seconds before the absurdity hit me. Me, the guy who'd spent half his life fixing broken sprinklers and shoveling his own driveway, now technically owned a subdivision worth millions. It didn't feel real until the official notice arrived 2 weeks later. It was simple, bureaucratic, almost boring. Property transfer acknowledgement, approved. But to me, it might as well have been a crown. When Greg finally called me, his voice was stripped of all that smug confidence. Mark, this has gotten out of hand, he said. You're going to ruin lives if you go through with this. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to squirm. Funny, I said finally. That's exactly what you said when you sold my land. He tried to pivot, offering to settle privately, maybe adjust a few things. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. I wasn't going to settle. I wasn't even sure I wanted revenge in the traditional sense anymore. I wanted something better. I wanted irony. Because the more I looked at those documents, the more delicious the idea became. They'd tried to erase my property boundaries to expand their power. Now I was in control of all of theirs. They wanted uniform lawns, perfect hedges, matching fences. I could make every house in that neighborhood a different color if I wanted. Or, maybe, I'd sell it all to someone who'd appreciate the land more than they ever did. Maybe even someone who'd turn their perfect little HOA utopia into something entirely different. The power wasn't just on paper, it was in my hands now. And I intended to use it. Owning the entire neighborhood sounded powerful on paper, but it felt surreal in practice. For a few days I didn't tell anyone beyond Rachel, just to see how things would unfold. The HOA had collapsed after Greg's resignation, leaving the neighborhood in a sort of lawless confusion. Without their self-appointed enforcers, people didn't know what to do with themselves. Lawns went unmowed, driveways overflowed with cars, and for the first time in years, no one cared if a trash can stayed out overnight. The irony made me laugh. The same people who once lived in fear of letters and fines now walked their dogs wherever they wanted like kids let out for summer break. I watched it all from my porch with quiet amusement, sipping coffee while trucks came and went, delivering soil, furniture, even trampolines that would have earned someone a fine just weeks before. But under the surface, something bigger was brewing. Rachel kept reminding me that power meant responsibility. Technically, I was now the landowner beneath all those houses. The homeowners still owned their buildings, but the ground their foundations sat on was mine. It was a legal tangle that would take months to fully unravel, but I didn't want to rush it. I wanted to use this leverage carefully, to make a point that would last longer than a victory headline. I started by quietly filing notices of reassessment to each property address, just formal letters explaining the situation in plain terms. The HOA had dissolved, and I was now managing the land rights pending clarification. The letters weren't threatening, but they stirred curiosity like gasoline meeting a spark. Within a week, my inbox was flooded with emails. Some polite, some confused, and a few hostile. Are you planning to charge us rent? Is this legal? Why didn't anyone tell us about this? I answered all of them politely, explaining that I had no intention of taking anyone's home, but I did intend to hold the former HOA accountable for its fraud. That alone earned me a surprising amount of support. People had grown to resent Greg's dictatorship more than I realized. One evening, I was walking the dog when a couple I barely knew approached me on the sidewalk. They lived 2 streets over, in one of those identical baize houses that had always looked interchangeable to me. "You're Mark, right?" the man asked. "The guy who took on the HOA?" I nodded. His wife grinned like she'd met a celebrity. "Thank you," she said. "Greg fined us $200 for a wind chime last year. Said it was audibly non-compliant." I almost laughed. "Well," I said, "you can hang as many wind chimes as you want now." It became a running joke around the neighborhood. People started calling it the revolution, painting their mailboxes or adding lawn gnomes as small acts of rebellion. The atmosphere was lighter, freer, but Greg wasn't done yet. He still had influence with a few residents, the ones who believed order was better than freedom. Greg began sending letters under the name of a temporary HOA transition committee. He claimed he was working to restore community stability and accused me of trying to exploit legal technicalities. I ignored him at first, but Rachel warned that letting him spread unchecked rumors could backfire. So I called him. His voice came through the phone smooth and defensive. "Mark, this is getting messy. You're scaring homeowners." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the window where the sunset painted the street in orange and gold. "Greg, you sold my land with a forged signature. I don't care if they're scared. They should know who was running their neighborhood into the ground." He sighed, pretending to sound reasonable. "Look, we both made mistakes. Maybe we can work something out." I could practically hear the sweat in his tone. "You mean like how you worked out selling my property?" I said. "We'll settle this legally. Don't call me again." Then I hung up. Rachel and I decided to push the next move, a public filing at the courthouse to reclaim full title to the subdivision. The clerk recognized me instantly. "You're the guy with the HOA case, right?" she said with a grin. I nodded. "Oh, you're about to make a lot of homeowners very happy." When the filing went public, local news picked it up. The headline wasn't subtle. Man reclaims land from corrupt HOA, legally owns entire neighborhood. It spread faster than I expected. People online cheered. Others debated whether it was possible. But the important part was that Greg's last shreds of credibility evaporated overnight. He tried to hold a town meeting to explain his side, but barely anyone showed up. The few who did recorded him fumbling through excuses. When someone asked about the forged deed, he blamed a clerical misunderstanding. The video went viral on social media, turning him into a meme. Despite the chaos, I still wanted to keep things civil with the neighbors who had done nothing wrong. So I held my own meeting a week later, inviting everyone to the local park. About 30 people showed up, curious and cautious. I explained the situation clearly, how the HOA had dissolved, how I legally held the land, and how my goal wasn't revenge but restoration. I promised that no one would be forced out and that I would work with the county to restructure the neighborhood into a cooperative association, one that gave residents real voting power instead of dictatorship. The reaction stunned me. People actually clapped. One elderly man even brought me a homemade pie afterward as a thank you. I wasn't used to being the hero of anything, but it felt strangely good. Still, not everyone was pleased. A few of Greg's loyalists started spreading rumors that I planned to evict everyone and sell the land to developers. Rachel laughed when she heard that. If only they knew what was actually coming, she said. Because the truth was, we were preparing something even bigger, a strategic move that would not only expose Greg completely but also guarantee I could never be challenged again. Rachel found out that before the HOA collapsed, Greg had signed a contract with a landscaping firm using the HOA's name. The contract was still active, but since the HOA no longer existed, all liabilities transferred to the property owner of record, me. That gave me control over the contract, and the firm was still owed thousands for unpaid work. Rachel suggested something wickedly poetic: assume control of the contract, pay the firm myself, and have them work directly for me to redesign the entire community green space that Greg had tried to build on my stolen land. The day the landscapers arrived, trucks full of soil and sod, Greg nearly lost his mind. He stormed down the street, demanding to see permits. I watched from my porch as he argued with the crew chief, who simply pointed to the paperwork with my name on it. "You can take it up with Mr. Davis," the man said. "He's the property owner." Greg turned toward me, fuming. "You're making a mistake," he shouted. "You're ruining this neighborhood." I couldn't resist. "Greg," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think you already did that yourself." Neighbors peeked through curtains. Some even clapped quietly. It was a small moment, but it felt like justice. Over the next week, the once claimed community garden transformed under my direction. Instead of the HOA's sterile flower beds and benches, I turned it into something more natural: fruit trees, walking paths, and a wooden sign that read "Public Access, no HOA restrictions." Kids started playing there after school, people walked dogs, and the space finally looked alive instead of manicured to death. It became a symbol of everything Greg had tried to control and failed. But the biggest shock came when a county official visited the site for inspection. After reviewing the property lines, he confirmed something that made Rachel's jaw drop. "Technically," he said, "this garden isn't just on your parcel. The road access, too, runs through land now under your title. That means the HOA's old community facilities, the pool, the parking lot, the office, all sit on your land." That night, Rachel and I sat on my porch under the string lights, laughing at the absurdity. "You realize," she said, "that you could literally charge the neighborhood for using its own streets." I chuckled. "Oh, I don't want their money," I said. "I want their attention." And I got it. Within days, Greg called again, this time with desperation instead of arrogance. "We can settle this privately," he pleaded. "You've proven your point." I didn't answer right away. I wanted him to feel the weight of the silence. "No, Greg," I said finally. "You tried to sell my land. I'm just returning the favor." The next step wasn't revenge for me, it was strategy. I quietly contacted a real estate development company that specialized in community management transitions. Rachel drafted an agreement giving them temporary operational rights to the neighborhood's land infrastructure, including streets and common areas. The same infrastructure the former HOA had proudly controlled. Within a week, the company sent out notices. Maintenance contracts were now under new management. The neighborhood was technically being sold, though no one fully understood how yet. When I saw Greg's car speeding out of the subdivision the next morning, I knew he'd finally realized it. He had tried to steal a garden, but I was about to sell his entire empire out from under him. The most satisfying part wasn't the money or even the legal victory. It was watching the neighborhood change. People began to talk to each other instead of hiding behind HOA rules. They helped one another fix fences, shared tools, and started planting flowers in places the HOA once called unauthorized vegetation. Freedom had made them better neighbors, and though they didn't know it yet, that freedom was about to become permanent. Because when the final deal closed, and the land rights officially transferred, it wouldn't go to another HOA or a greedy developer. It would go to the residents themselves, under a trust one was creating for them. Greg had taken what was mine, so I took what was his, and gave it to everyone he tried to control. The irony was almost poetic. The days that followed felt like living inside a movie where the hero had just flipped the script and the villains didn't know it yet. Greg had gone silent, but his loyalists were restless. A few of them started small campaigns to restore order, posting homemade flyers about community unity and protecting property values. But no one took them seriously anymore. They looked like relics from an era that had already ended. What fascinated me most was watching how people adapted when the rules that had once suffocated them suddenly disappeared. A woman across the street painted her front door bright turquoise, a color that would have made Greg issue a fine within an hour. Someone else built a little library box by the sidewalk. Kids rode bikes freely again without parents worrying about noise complaints. The air felt different, lighter, as if the whole subdivision had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Yet beneath the laughter and new paint, a quiet tension lingered, because everyone knew something big was coming next. The rumor that I planned to sell the entire neighborhood wasn't entirely wrong. Rachel had warned me that once the sale documents were public, things would escalate quickly. We were working with a development firm that specialized in community transitions, and they had already drafted preliminary offers. But it wasn't just about money. It was about creating a permanent record of how arrogance and deceit could implode on themselves. I wanted the neighborhood to exist without an HOA forever, and the only way to ensure that was to legally restructure ownership in a way that made it impossible for another one to form. The trust Rachel designed would make the land collectively owned by the residents, with permanent clauses preventing any governing body from forming again. It was poetic justice disguised as paperwork. But before we could finalize it, the chaos reached a boiling point. It started when Greg appeared again, this time not as the self-righteous president but as the desperate man trying to cling to the illusion of power. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, his white SUV pulled into my driveway. I heard the slam of his door before I saw him. He stormed up to my porch with a stack of papers in hand, his face red and his voice shaking with anger. "You've gone too far, Mark," he shouted. "You can't just sell people's homes." I stood at the doorway, calm and unbothered, watching him unravel. "I'm not selling their homes," I said. "I'm selling my land. The land you stole. Big difference." He waved the papers at me. "You think this is over? I've spoken to an attorney. You'll be sued for fraud." I stepped closer so he could see the smirk I couldn't suppress. "Good luck finding an attorney who'll represent a man who forged documents. You might want to check your own pending investigation first." His eyes flickered. He hadn't expected me to know about that. Rachel had discovered that the county prosecutor had quietly opened a case into the fake deed transfer. Greg didn't respond. He just stared at me, his expression a mixture of rage and fear, then turned and stomped back to his car. The tires screeched as he sped away. I knew that wouldn't be the last I'd see of him. The next morning, Rachel called with a tone that was half amusement, half warning. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Greg's lawyer just filed an injunction to stop the sale. But the name on the filing isn't Greg's. It's his wife's." I almost laughed. "He's using his wife as a shield now?" Rachel sighed. "Apparently. But don't worry. The judge will throw it out. The HOA doesn't exist, and they have no standing." She was right. 2 days later, the injunction was dismissed before it even reached a hearing. That same week, the developer's team arrived for official land assessment. Their survey trucks rolled through the streets, scanning lots, measuring curbs, and documenting the condition of the neighborhood. It caused a minor panic. People peeked through blinds, whispering, wondering what was happening. I received at least 30 emails that day asking if they were about to lose their homes. I spent hours replying one by one, reassuring everyone that the purpose was reclassification, not eviction. Most people believed me. A few didn't. But that was fine. Change always came with noise. As the paperwork moved forward, the cracks in the old hierarchy widened. Greg's closest allies started turning on him. One of them, a man named Philip who had served as the HOA treasurer, came to my door late one evening, looking exhausted. He confessed that Greg had been pocketing fines for years, funneling thousands into his personal account. "I thought it was wrong," he said, "but he said it was for community maintenance. Now the tax board is auditing me." I could see the fear in his eyes. "If I cooperate," he asked, "can I clear my name?" I told him the truth. "Maybe not completely. But you can help expose the whole thing." The next morning, Rachel filed a report to the county's financial crimes unit with Philip's statement attached. That was the moment everything tipped. The story that had started as a small neighborhood feud became a local scandal. News crews showed up, interviewing residents and digging into Greg's past. They found enough evidence of fraud to keep investigators busy for months. The man who once ruled over mailbox paint colors was now a headline about corruption. The day the news broke, I was sitting at my kitchen table, half reading the paper and half enjoying the quiet satisfaction that came from poetic justice. But satisfaction turned to adrenaline when I heard a car pull up outside again. I looked through the blinds and saw Greg standing on the sidewalk, looking lost. He didn't have his usual swagger. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted around like he was afraid someone might see him. I went out to meet him. For a long moment we just stood there in silence, the kind that felt heavy with all the words we didn't need to say. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said finally. "I was trying to improve the community." I studied him, trying to decide if there was even a trace of honesty in that voice. "You forged documents," I said quietly. "You bullied people. You stole from them. You sold my land." His lips trembled, but he said nothing. I took a step closer. "The community doesn't need improving, Greg. It needed freeing." He nodded once, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him, then walked away without another word. That was the last time I ever saw him in that neighborhood. After he left, things moved faster. The sale finalized within 3 weeks. Rachel handled the logistics while I focused on preparing the trust transition. Every resident would become a partial landholder, no longer subject to any HOA authority. When the documents were signed, I hosted one last meeting at the park where everything had started. I explained the transfer plan, how each homeowner now owned their land outright, and how the community's infrastructure, streets, sidewalks, parks, would remain under a shared maintenance fund, not a governing body. There were tears, cheers, even laughter. People clapped, hugged, and thanked me like I'd done something heroic. But I told them the truth. You did this yourselves. You stopped being afraid. That night, I sat alone on my porch under the quiet hum of summer crickets. The lights from the park glowed softly in the distance, illuminating the sign that still read "Public Access, No HOA Restrictions." It felt symbolic, a monument to everything that had happened. I thought about the chain of events that started it all, the sign on my property, the forged deed, Greg's smug grin, and how it had spiraled into something much bigger than revenge. It had turned into a lesson about power, greed, and the strange beauty of consequences. I wondered what Greg was doing at that moment, probably drowning in legal paperwork and regret. But I didn't feel hatred anymore. Only closure. The following week, a letter arrived from the county. It was an official acknowledgement of the new subdivision designation, Independent Residential Cooperative, privately managed. No mention of an HOA. No reference to Greg's legacy. It was over, clean and final. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a folder marked "Victory." For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I walked through the neighborhood that evening, and for once, every house looked different. Front yards reflected personalities instead of regulations. Kids' chalk drawings covered the sidewalk. Someone had even painted a mural on the community wall that said, "Freedom looks like this." As I stood there watching the sunset over what used to be Greg's empire, Rachel called. "It's done," she said simply. "The trust's been recorded. No HOA can ever form there again." I smiled, looking around at the colorful, imperfect, alive neighborhood. "Good," I said. "Let it stay that way." She paused. "You know," she said with a hint of a laugh, "you could have sold this place for millions. Developers would have lined up." I chuckled softly. "Yeah, but then I'd be no better than them." When I hung up, I realized something I hadn't before. The real victory wasn't in the land or the money or even the humiliation I'd dealt Greg. It was in giving people something they didn't know they'd lost. Their right to live freely without fear of someone like him dictating their lives. The streetlights flickered on, and I took one last slow walk past the garden that had once been the battleground of this entire mess. The fruit trees were growing fast, their leaves rustling in the warm evening breeze. Kids were chasing fireflies, laughing, their parents sitting nearby on benches that used to be forbidden after dark. Everything felt alive again. I realized then that sometimes revenge doesn't have to destroy. Sometimes the best revenge is rebuilding something better than what your enemy ever imagined. And as I stood there beneath the stars, listening to the faint sounds of laughter echoing through the neighborhood, I knew that was exactly what I'd done. By the time autumn rolled in, the neighborhood had changed beyond recognition. What was once a manicured display of uniform lawns and fear-driven perfection had turned into something real, something human. There were mismatched fences, garden boxes sprouting late tomatoes, and kids' toys scattered across driveways without anyone complaining. The peace was strange at first, almost disorienting. People were so used to living under rules that freedom felt like rebellion. But every day the fear faded a little more, replaced by laughter, cooperation, and a kind of pride I hadn't seen before. Even I had trouble believing that the same place once held weekly HOA meetings where neighbors tattled on each other for leaving Christmas lights up too long. It felt like a new chapter for everyone, but for me it wasn't over. Because while Greg had vanished, his mistakes still left behind one final loose thread, a property dispute involving the commercial lot where the old HOA office had stood. That little office was technically part of my land now, and since it had been abandoned after the sale, it sat empty and overgrown. Most people ignored it, but to me, it was a monument to the nonsense that had consumed this place. I decided to do something with it. At first, I thought about tearing it down, but Rachel convinced me otherwise. "Turn it into something useful," she said. "Something that flips the story." That idea stuck with me. So I called a local construction crew and told them to remodel it into a small coffee shop. Nothing fancy, just a cozy little place with big windows, good chairs, and a sign that would make everyone smile. When it opened 2 months later, the line stretched down the block. The sign over the door said "Grounds for Appeal." It was Rachel's idea, and it became an instant hit. People loved the irony. The place that once sent threatening letters about trash bins was now where neighbors came to laugh about it over lattes. I never planned to run a coffee shop, but I found myself spending mornings there just to watch how the community had healed. The same people who used to glare at each other during HOA meetings now chatted like old friends. One afternoon, a man I barely recognized approached me with a shy smile. He introduced himself as Adam, one of the residents who had supported Greg early on. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "I believed him when he said you were trying to take our homes. I didn't realize what he'd done." I told him not to worry. Everyone had been deceived in one way or another. What mattered was that people had finally learned to trust one another instead of fearing each other. As we talked, I realized how far everything had come from the day I found that red "Sold" sign in my yard. But just when I thought the story had reached its peaceful ending, Rachel called with that familiar tone of cautious excitement in her voice. "You might want to sit down," she said. Guess who resurfaced? I didn't have to ask. Greg. According to her, he'd filed a lawsuit claiming he was entitled to compensation for emotional distress and damage to his reputation. The irony almost made me laugh. "He's suing me for ruining his reputation?" I said. "He ruined it himself." Rachel chuckled. "I know. But don't worry, it won't go anywhere. Still, it might be fun to make an example of him." The idea of Greg walking into court, trying to act righteous while the truth sat neatly stacked in our folders, was too good to resist. I told her to go ahead and file a counterclaim, for fraud, defamation, and the cost of every hour I'd spent cleaning up his mess. When the hearing date came, I showed up in a simple gray suit, the kind that didn't need to say anything. Greg arrived looking exhausted, his tie crooked and his hair thinner than I remembered. He tried to meet my eyes, but his confidence was gone. The judge didn't even need to hear much. Rachel presented the original forged deed, the inactive HOA registration, and Greg's personal withdrawals from the association account. By the time she finished, Greg's lawyer had his head in his hands. The judge dismissed his lawsuit immediately and ordered him to pay court costs. Greg stood there in silence, humiliated. I didn't celebrate out loud. I just watched him walk out of that courtroom, smaller than ever, and I felt the last piece of anger finally dissolve. Revenge wasn't the point anymore. Justice had already been served in ways he couldn't even comprehend. The next day, I went to the coffee shop early, before anyone else arrived. I stood behind the counter, staring at the empty tables and the soft morning light streaming through the windows. The air smelled like roasted beans and quiet satisfaction. I thought about how all of this had started over a patch of land barely big enough for a garden, and how it had ended up changing an entire community. Rachel stopped by later with her usual grin. "You realize you've become a legend around here, right?" she said. "There's talk of naming the park after you." I laughed and shook my head. "No names," I said. "The best kind of victory is the one people just live in." She nodded thoughtfully. "Still, it's one hell of a story. The man who bought back his peace and sold an entire neighborhood to save it." As the months passed, the coffee shop became a symbol of the new beginning. It wasn't just a business. It was a gathering place, a reminder of what could happen when ordinary people stood up to arrogance. Sometimes I'd overhear snippets of conversation that made me smile, people telling newcomers about the HOA that got outsmarted, or how Mark turned the tables without losing his cool. I never corrected them. I didn't need to. The story had taken on a life of its own, a small legend born from suburban chaos. Even the county newspaper ran a follow-up piece titled, "From HOA to Harmony," painting the neighborhood as an example of civic renewal. One evening, I locked up the coffee shop and took a walk through the street. The lights glowed softly in the windows, and laughter drifted from a backyard where someone was hosting a barbecue. It felt like the neighborhood had finally become what it was supposed to be, a community. I stopped at the park, the same place where I'd first confronted Greg months ago, and sat on one of the benches beneath the fruit trees. The trees had grown fast, their branches heavy with apples and pears. A few kids were still playing even though the sun had almost set. Their parents watched nearby, relaxed and smiling. The world felt right again. Then, just as I was about to leave, a car pulled up at the curb. For a moment, my heart skipped. But it wasn't Greg. It was Philip, the former treasurer who had helped expose him. He waved as he got out, carrying a small box. "Hey Mark," he said. "I thought you'd want this." He handed me the box. Inside was the old HOA gavel, the one Greg used to bang dramatically during meetings. "Found it when we cleaned out the storage unit," Philip said. "Thought you might want to burn it or something." I laughed. "No," I said. "I think it belongs here." I walked over to the park's community board, the same one where the HOA once posted their endless rule lists, and nailed the gavel to the top of it. Below it, I pinned a new note that simply said, "No more meetings." Philip burst out laughing. "That's perfect," he said. As I walked home, the cool night breeze carried the faint sound of music from one of the houses. The neighborhood was alive again, not with order but with joy. And as I reached my porch, I realized that something inside me had changed too. I didn't feel like the man who'd been wronged anymore. I felt like the man who'd taken control, not through anger or vengeance, but through persistence and a little bit of humor. I had turned the weapon they used against me, paperwork, signatures, bureaucracy, into the very tool that set everyone free. A few weeks later, Rachel called again with news that made me laugh out loud. The development firm that had helped with the transition offered to buy the coffee shop as a franchise pilot. They wanted to turn Grounds for Appeal into a regional brand celebrating community independence. "Looks like your revenge might turn into a business," she said, amused. I told her I'd think about it, but deep down, I knew I wasn't in it for the money. I just liked knowing that something good had come from all the chaos. I spent that evening sitting on the shop's porch, watching the sun go down, and thinking about how strange life could be. One forged deed had set off a chain reaction that ended in freedom, laughter, and the best coffee in the county. The next morning, as I unlocked the shop, I noticed someone had left a small card taped to the door. It was unsigned, written in careful handwriting. It said, "Thank you for giving us back our homes." I stood there for a long moment, reading it over and over, until I felt something tighten in my chest. For all the legal battles, the strategy, the careful moves, I realized this was the real payoff. Not the headlines or the satisfaction of seeing Greg fall, but this quiet gratitude from people who could finally breathe again. I took the card, pinned it behind the counter next to the espresso machine, and got to work. The grinder hummed, the aroma filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that rarest kind of peace. The kind that comes when justice doesn't just punish, but heals. Winter came softly that year, coating the roofs and trees in a clean, quiet layer of white that made everything feel new again. The neighborhood, once so rigid and uniform, looked almost magical in the snow. No one cared anymore about matching decorations or approved color palette. One house had rainbow lights, another had a giant inflatable snowman leaning slightly to one side, and someone even built a snow fort in the park. No fines, no letters, just laughter and snowball fights echoing through the cold air. Sometimes, as I stood outside the coffee shop with a steaming mug in my hands, I caught myself smiling at how unbelievable it all seemed. The same people who once avoided eye contact at HOA meetings now helped each other shovel driveways and shared cups of cocoa. The transformation was so complete it almost felt like a dream. But life, as it tends to, still had one last twist waiting for me, one more turn before the story could truly close. It started with a phone call I didn't expect. A reporter from a national magazine had heard about the case and wanted to do a feature titled, "The Man Who Sold the HOA." I wasn't sure if I wanted that kind of attention, but Rachel convinced me it could help set the record straight. You didn't just win, she said. You changed the way people think about community power. Tell that story. So I agreed. The reporter, a sharp woman named Claire, came to visit on a brisk morning. She was polite but observant, asking questions that went deeper than the usual surface curiosity. Why didn't you keep the land? She asked as we sat in the coffee shop surrounded by the warm hum of conversation. I thought for a long moment before answering. Because control was never the goal, I said finally. They used power to control. I used it to set people free. That's the difference. She nodded, scribbling in her notebook, her eyes thoughtful. When the article came out weeks later, it went viral. The headline read, "From Stolen Acre to Freedom: How One Man Outwitted an HOA and Gave His Neighborhood Back." The attention was overwhelming at first. People from across the country reached out, some to congratulate me, others to ask for advice. I got emails from homeowners in other states who were fighting their own HOAs, some even considering legal action. Rachel joked that I'd accidentally become a folk hero. It was surreal. One man in Texas wrote that reading about my story gave him courage to stand up against his HOA's bullying. A woman in Florida sent a photo of her freshly painted purple mailbox with a note that said, "Inspired by you." I pinned that photo on the wall of the coffee shop right next to the thank you card someone had left months earlier. It was funny how something that had started as a personal battle had turned into a movement. Still, for all the pride and satisfaction, I couldn't help but think about Greg sometimes. Not with anger anymore, but curiosity. I wondered what had become of him after the court case. The last I'd heard, he'd moved 2 towns over and was trying to start a new real estate firm, but it hadn't gone well. People still remembered his name. His reputation was beyond repair. One afternoon, as snow fell softly outside, I got my answer. Greg himself walked into the coffee shop. He looked older, smaller somehow, like the weight of the past year had hollowed him out. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he walked up to the counter, ordered a black coffee, and quietly asked if we could talk. I agreed, out of curiosity more than anything else. We sat at a corner table where he stared into his cup for a long time before speaking. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought control meant progress." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I didn't know what to say at first. The part of me that had wanted to see him humiliated was long gone. Now, seeing him like this, I just felt tired. "We all think we're right until we're not," I said finally. "The difference is what we do after we realize it." He nodded slowly, eyes downcast. When he left, he didn't say goodbye. He just walked out into the snow and disappeared down the street. That was the last time I ever saw him. The months that followed were peaceful in a way I hadn't known before. The trust functioned perfectly, the residents managed the maintenance fund responsibly, and the community flourished. People planted more trees, started a weekend market in the park, and even organized a small festival in the summer. The place that had once been defined by control had become a symbol of freedom. Every year on the anniversary of the trust signing, the neighbors threw a party at the park with food stalls, music, and laughter. Someone always brought up the story of how it all started, but each time it sounded a little more like a legend than a legal case. I liked it that way. It meant the pain had faded, replaced by pride. One evening, as I locked up the coffee shop, Rachel stopped by with 2 cups of tea. We sat outside under the warm glow of the streetlights, watching the neighborhood settle into its nighttime quiet. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. I smiled. "Honestly? No. I think for once, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She nodded. "You built something bigger than you realize. You didn't just win a fight, you changed the story of what power looks like." I looked out at the park, at the faint outline of the gavel still nailed to the community board, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next battle. I'd already won the one that mattered. Later that night, long after Rachel had gone, I sat alone inside the shop with only the soft hum of the espresso machine and the ticking of the wall clock for company. I thought about how strange life could be, how something so small could spiral into something so big. A forged signature. A stolen plot of land. A fight for fairness that turned into something much larger than revenge. I remembered the faces of my neighbors at that first chaotic HOA meeting, the fear and confusion, and how far they'd come. Now those same people were free, not just legally, but emotionally. And maybe that was what made it all worth it. As the clock ticked past midnight, I locked up and stepped outside. The snow had stopped, and the stars were scattered bright and clear across the sky. The air was sharp, clean, and still. Across the park, I could see the faint outline of the fruit trees glistening with frost. The sign at the garden entrance caught my eye again, the one that still read public access. No HOA restrictions. The paint was faded now, but it didn't matter. It had done its job. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold bite of winter air fill my lungs, and smiled to myself. There was no more anger left, no unfinished business. Just peace. In the following spring, Claire's magazine story was nominated for a national award, and she sent me a copy of the certificate with a handwritten note that said, "For proving that revenge can build instead of break." I framed it and hung it on the wall near the counter. Visitors still ask about it sometimes, and I tell them the short version of the story. The one about a neighborhood that learned freedom is better than perfection. They always leave smiling, and sometimes they tell me their own stories of standing up to bullies in suits and ties. It makes me realize that what happened here wasn't just about one HOA or one man's stubbornness. It was about something universal, the quiet, unstoppable power of saying no to injustice and yes to community. Years later, people still talk about it. The park is thriving, the trees are taller, and the coffee shop is still full every morning. The gavel still hangs on the board, a silent reminder of what used to be and what should never return. Every once in a while, I'll see a new family moving in, waving at neighbors as they unload boxes, and someone inevitably tells them, "You picked the right place." No HOA, no nonsense, just good people. And every time I hear that, I feel that same warmth in my chest. Because they're right. It's not just land anymore. It's a community, one built on fairness, laughter, and freedom. And sometimes, when I lock up at night and glance across the snow-dusted rooftops, I think back to that first day when I saw the red sold sign staked into my yard. I remember the anger, the disbelief, and the vow I made to fight back. I didn't know then that I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for everyone who'd ever been silenced by power disguised as order. And in the end, that fight didn't just give me my land back. It gave all of us something far greater, the right to live on our own terms. And that, I realized as I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, was worth every single battle.